Before you get too relaxed, please remember to like and subscribe. Imagine a world where books are as rare and precious as gold. A world where a single Bible might cost as much as a house, where a university library holding 300 books is considered remarkably well-stocked, where the vast majority of people will live their entire lives without ever holding a book in their hands. Now imagine that you're standing in a workshop in Mainz, Germany in the year 1450. The air is thick with the smell of metal and oil. A man named Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith by trade, a debtor by circumstance, and a visionary by temperament, is hunched over a workbench, adjusting a piece of metal type. He's been working on this project in secret for years, borrowing money he can barely hope to repay, obsessed with an idea that most people would consider either foolish or impossible. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to change everything. Within a generation of this moment, printing presses will spread across Europe like wildfire. Within a century, millions of books will exist where once there were only thousands. The world of rare, precious, hand-copied manuscripts will vanish, replaced by a world where knowledge can be reproduced and distributed at a scale previously unimaginable. This revolution in information will make possible the Protestant Reformation, which will shatter the unity of Western Christianity and redraw the religious map of Europe. It will enable the scientific revolution, allowing discoveries to be shared, verified, and built upon in ways that were impossible before. It will contribute to the rise of democracy, the spread of literacy, the development of modern education, and the emergence of what we now call the modern world. But none of that is visible in this workshop in Mainz. Here, there's just a man, some metal type, a modified wine press, and an idea, the idea that if you could create movable, reusable letters and arrange them into pages, you could print books faster and cheaper than anyone ever had before. The invention of the printing press with movable type is often called one of the most important innovations in human history, and with good reason. But to understand why it mattered so much, we need to understand the world it transformed. A world where information flowed slowly, where knowledge was controlled by the few, where the written word was a luxury that most people never experienced. We need to understand what it meant when, suddenly, dramatically, that world began to change. When the dam broke and information began to flow in torrents. When books went from being rare treasures to becoming commonplace objects. When the monopoly on knowledge that the church and the aristocracy had maintained for centuries began to crack and then to shatter. This is the story of how one man's invention, or more accurately, his synthesis of several existing technologies into something new, transformed human civilization. It's the story of how the printing press changed not just how we store and share information, but how we think, how we argue, how we organize society, how we understand truth itself. It's a story with clear heroes and villains, with brilliant innovations and desperate financial struggles, with world-changing consequences that emerged from the modest workshop of a craftsman who died in relative obscurity. It's a story about technology and power, about freedom and control, about the unstoppable force of ideas once they're freed from the chains of scarcity. Join us now as we travel back to that pivotal moment in the mid-15th century, when Johannes Gutenberg stood at his press and pulled the first page of what would become the Gutenberg Bible, and in doing so, pulled the lever that would move the world into modernity. To truly appreciate the revolution that Gutenberg sparked, we must first immerse ourselves in the world of the medieval manuscript, a world that had existed for over 1,000 years and seemed as eternal and unchangeable as the seasons themselves. In this world, every book was a unique object, created by human hands working letter by letter, line by line, page by page. The process was painstaking, laborious, and remarkably expensive in both time and resources. Books were made in scriptoriums, dedicated writing rooms, usually in monasteries or attached to cathedrals and universities. Here, scribes sat at individual desks or carrels, carefully copying texts by hand onto sheets of prepared animal skin called parchment or vellum. The very best vellum came from calfskin, but sheepskin and goatskin were also used. A single Bible might require the skins of 300 sheep. The scribe's work demanded extraordinary concentration and skill. Copying was done in beautiful, formal scripts, Caroline minuscule in earlier centuries, Gothic scripts later. Each letter had to be formed precisely, consistently. Margins had to be measured and maintained. Lines had to be straight and evenly spaced. The work was physically demanding. Hours bent over a desk in poor light, hand cramping from gripping the quill, eyes straining to read the exemplar, the book being copied, and to see the page being written. The process was slow, agonizingly slow by our standards. An experienced scribe working full-time might copy 4 pages per day. A substantial book of several hundred pages could take months to complete. A large Bible could occupy a scribe for a year or more. And this was just the copying. There was also the preparation of the parchment, the mixing of inks, and, for luxury books, the work of illuminators who added decorated initials, margin illustrations, and elaborate full-page miniatures. The costs were staggering. The materials alone, parchment, inks, binding materials, represented a significant investment. When you added the skilled labor of scribes and illuminators, often working for months, the final cost of a book could equal what a skilled craftsman might earn in a year or more. A university professor's annual salary might not cover the cost of a single important book. This meant that books were rare and precious objects. A parish church might own a single Bible, kept chained to a lectern both to prevent theft and because its weight made it impractical to move. A cathedral library holding 50 books was doing well. A university library with a few hundred volumes was considered impressively well-stocked. The Great Library at the University of Paris in the mid-14th century contained perhaps 1,700 volumes and was one of the largest collections in Europe. Private ownership of books was largely limited to the very wealthy. A prosperous merchant might own a prayer book. A nobleman might have a small collection of religious texts and perhaps some classical works or chronicles. A king or great prince might possess a library of 50 or 100 volumes, a treasure representing enormous wealth. The content of books reflected these economic realities. Religious texts dominated: Bibles, psalters, prayer books, commentaries on scripture, theological treatises, lives of saints. These were the books that monasteries needed for their religious life, that the church valued, that wealthy laypeople wanted for their private devotions. Classical texts from Greece and Rome were preserved, but in relatively limited quantities. Contemporary writing in the vernacular languages, poetry, romances, chronicles, existed but was far less common than Latin religious texts. The rarity of books had profound implications for society and culture. Literacy rates were low, probably 10 to 15% of the population in the more urbanized and prosperous regions of Europe, far lower in rural areas. And even among the literate, access to books was limited. You might be able to read but have almost nothing to read. Education was restricted by the scarcity of texts. Universities existed and were growing in number, but students often couldn't afford textbooks. Instead, the teaching method relied heavily on oral presentation and memorization. A professor would read from his book, perhaps the only copy available, and students would memorize what they heard or take notes if they could afford paper and ink. The phrase "to lecture" comes from the Latin legere, to read. The professor literally read the book aloud while students listened. The control of knowledge was closely held by the church and the educated elite. Monasteries were the primary repositories of learning, their libraries the treasure houses of accumulated knowledge. The clergy, educated in Latin and with access to books, held a monopoly on religious knowledge and interpretation. The Bible itself was in Latin, the Vulgate translation by St. Jerome, incomprehensible to the vast majority even if they had been able to access a copy. This control extended to what was copied and preserved. The church decided which texts were worth reproducing. Monastery libraries emphasized religious works. Classical pagan texts were copied selectively. Those deemed compatible with Christian teaching or useful for education might be preserved. Others might be allowed to disappear. Heterodox or heretical works were actively suppressed, and without mechanical reproduction, suppression could be effective. Destroy the few existing copies of a dangerous book, and the ideas it contained might vanish. The process of copying also introduced errors. No matter how careful the scribe, mistakes crept in. A misread word, a line accidentally skipped or repeated, a moment of inattention. When copies were made from copies, errors accumulated. Different manuscripts of the same work might vary significantly, and there was no way to be certain which version was most accurate. Scholars trying to study classical or biblical texts faced the challenge of variant manuscripts with no clear way to establish the correct reading. Standardization was impossible. Each book was unique, a product of an individual scribe's hand. Even multiple copies of the same text from the same scriptorium would vary in script style, layout, decoration. There was no such thing as an edition in our sense. No group of identical copies that scholars in different locations could study simultaneously, confident they were looking at exactly the same text. The process of intellectual communication was slow and uncertain. A scholar who made a discovery or developed a new idea might write a treatise, but how would it reach others? A few copies might be made by scribes commissioned for the purpose, but the expense limited distribution. The manuscript might be shared with colleagues in the same monastery or university, perhaps sent to a few other institutions, but reaching a wide audience was difficult or impossible. Innovation and progress in learning were constrained by these limitations. A scholar might spend years arriving at an insight that someone else had already discovered, but if that earlier work hadn't reached him, he couldn't build on it. Mistakes could persist for generations because the correct information was trapped in a manuscript in a distant library. Debates proceeded slowly, with written responses taking months or years to arrive. Yet this was the only world that Europeans of the 14th and early 15th centuries knew. Books had always been rare, precious, and laboriously copied by hand. This seemed as natural and immutable as the fact that travel was by horse or that the sun rose in the east. The idea that it could be otherwise, that books might be produced quickly, cheaply, in large quantities was barely imaginable. But change was stirring. Paper, introduced to Europe from the Islamic world via Spain and Italy, was becoming more widely available. Paper was cheaper than parchment, and while early Europeans distrusted it, it seemed less durable. By the 15th century, it was gaining acceptance. The availability of cheaper writing material would prove crucial for the printing revolution. Demand for books was growing. Universities were proliferating across Europe. By 1500, there would be over 60, up from perhaps 20 in 1300. A growing merchant class had money and aspirations to learning. The Renaissance was beginning in Italy, creating interest in classical texts and contemporary scholarship. There was a hunger for knowledge that manuscript production simply couldn't satisfy. The stage was set. The technology of manuscript production had reached its limits. Demand was rising beyond what the existing system could supply. Economic and social changes were creating both a market for books and a class of craftsmen with the technical skills to attempt innovation. What was needed was someone with the vision to see a different way, the technical skill to make it work, and the determination to persist despite the enormous challenges and costs involved. That person was working in Mainz, Germany, and his name was Johannes Gutenberg. Johannes Gensfleisch zur Leyden zum Gutenberg, to give him his full, rather unwieldy name, was born sometime around 1400 in Mainz, an important city on the Rhine River in what is now Western Germany. We don't know the exact date of his birth, and in fact, much of his life remains frustratingly obscure. He wasn't famous during his lifetime, and he left relatively little documentation. Much of what we know about him comes from legal and financial records, contracts, loan agreements, and lawsuits, rather than from any account of his achievements or character. This obscurity is itself telling. Gutenberg lived and died in relative anonymity. He wasn't celebrated in his own time as a revolutionary inventor. He struggled financially throughout his life and died without wealth or particular fame. Yet his invention would reshape the world far more profoundly than the achievements of most kings and conquerors. What we do know is that Gutenberg came from a family involved in the goldsmith trade and in the production of coins for the Archbishop of Mainz. This background would prove crucial. Goldsmithing required sophisticated metalworking skills, knowledge of alloys, casting, precision work with small objects. The goldsmith needed to understand how different metals behaved when heated and cooled, how to create molds, how to produce multiple identical copies of decorative elements. All of these skills would be essential for creating movable type. Mainz in the early 15th century was a significant commercial center and ecclesiastical seat. As the home of an archbishop-elector, one of the 7 princes who elected the Holy Roman Emperor, it was politically important. It had guilds, craftsmen, merchants, and a cathedral with an educated clergy. It was the kind of place where someone with technical skills and ambition might dream of making something significant. But Gutenberg's early life included conflict and dislocation. In the 1420s, political strife between the guilds and the patrician families of Mainz led to upheaval. Gutenberg's family, part of the patrician class, was apparently forced to leave the city for a time. Gutenberg spent some years in Strasbourg, another important Rhine city, where he worked as a goldsmith and became involved in various business ventures. It was probably during the Strasbourg period, in the late 1430s and early 1440s, that Gutenberg began his experiments with printing. The evidence is fragmentary and comes mainly from a lawsuit in 1439, where former business partners sued him, claiming he had taken their investment in a venture he was keeping secret from them. The lawsuit documents mention printing and forms and mysterious tools and materials, suggesting that Gutenberg was already working on some kind of printing technology. What exactly he was working on remains unclear from these documents. He was certainly secretive about it, conducting experiments behind closed doors, making partners swear oaths not to reveal what he was doing, dismantling equipment if anyone unauthorized approached. This secrecy makes sense. If he could develop a practical method of printing, it would be enormously valuable, and he couldn't afford to have others steal the technology before he had perfected and profited from it. By the mid-1440s, Gutenberg had returned to Mainz, where he continued his work. But he faced a problem that would plague him throughout his career. He needed money, and he didn't have it. Developing printing technology required extended experimentation, expensive materials, specialized equipment, and time, years of time when he wasn't earning income from other work. He needed financial backing. In 1450, he entered into a partnership with a wealthy merchant and financier named Johann Fust. Fust lent Gutenberg 800 guilders, an enormous sum, to set up a printing workshop. Later, Fust lent him another 800 guilders. In return, Fust would share in the profits from whatever Gutenberg produced. This partnership would prove both crucial and ultimately devastating to Gutenberg. With Fust's money, Gutenberg was able to set up a proper workshop, hire assistants, acquire materials, and work toward his goal: producing printed books that could compete in quality with the finest manuscripts while being produced faster and more cheaply. But what exactly was he trying to do, and why was it so difficult? The concept of printing itself wasn't new. Woodblock printing had been known in Europe for decades, brought from Asia where it had been used for centuries. With woodblock printing, you carved an entire page of text and illustrations into a block of wood, inked the raised surface, and pressed paper against it. This could produce multiple copies of a single sheet image or text, playing cards, religious images, even short texts like the Donatus, a basic Latin grammar used in schools. But woodblock printing had severe limitations. Carving a full page of text into wood was nearly as time-consuming as copying it by hand. The wooden blocks wore out relatively quickly, and most importantly, you couldn't reuse the text. Each page had to be carved from scratch. For printing a long book, woodblock printing offered little advantage over manuscript production. What Gutenberg envisioned was something different: movable type. Instead of carving a full page, you would create individual letters, each letter as a separate, reusable piece of metal. You could arrange these letters into words, words into lines, lines into pages, print as many copies as you needed, then disassemble the page and reuse the letters for the next page. The letters would be durable enough to be used thousands of times. This was the key insight, the revolutionary idea. But making it work required solving multiple technical challenges that would have defeated most people. First, the type itself. The letters had to be metal, durable enough to withstand the pressure of printing thousands of times, hard enough to produce sharp, clean impressions. But metal casting presented problems. The type had to be identical, all the A's exactly the same height, width, and shape, so they would line up properly and print evenly. Any variation would be visible in the printed page. Gutenberg developed a sophisticated typecasting system. He created a mold that could produce individual letters quickly and consistently. The mold had to be adjustable to accommodate letters of different widths. An I is narrower than an M, after all. He had to develop a metal alloy that was hard enough to be durable but soft enough to cast precisely. He settled on a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony that worked perfectly. This alloy could be melted at relatively low temperature, cast sharply in the mold and cooled quickly, and the resulting type was hard, durable, and long-lasting. Second, the ink. Manuscript ink, water-based, wouldn't work for printing. It didn't adhere properly to metal and produced uneven, blotchy results. Gutenberg adapted techniques from oil painting, creating an oil-based ink that stuck to metal type, transferred evenly to paper, and dried to a permanent, black finish. This seems like a small detail, but it was essential. Without the right ink, the technology wouldn't work. Third, the press itself. Gutenberg needed a device that could press paper against the ink type with even, consistent pressure across the entire page. He adapted the design of the screw press used for wine and olive oil production. This press could exert powerful, even pressure and could be operated relatively quickly. With practiced workers, a printing press could produce several hundred impressions per day, far faster than any scribe could work. Finally, there were countless smaller challenges. How do you arrange the type so it stays in place during printing? How do you ensure even spacing between words and lines? How do you handle different sizes of type for initials or headings? How do you organize and store thousands of pieces of type? How do you train workers in this entirely new process? Gutenberg spent years solving these problems. The work was conducted largely in secret in his Mainz workshop. He experimented with different alloys, different mold designs, different ink formulations. He tested and refined his press. He developed the entire system, not just the technology but the practical methods of typesetting, printing, and organizing production. By the early 1450s, he was ready. He had a system that worked. He had skilled assistants, including Peter Schoeffer, who would later become important in his own right as a printer. He had Fust's financial backing, and he had chosen his first major project, the one that would demonstrate beyond question that printing could produce books as beautiful as any manuscript, that this wasn't just a novelty but the future of book production. He was going to print a Bible. To truly understand Gutenberg's achievement, we need to look closely at the system he created. It wasn't a single invention but rather a sophisticated integration of multiple technologies, each precisely engineered to work together. What Gutenberg accomplished was taking separate elements. Some borrowed from existing crafts, some adapted, some invented from scratch, and combining them into a revolutionary whole. Let's begin with movable type, the heart of the system. The concept of movable type wasn't entirely new. Chinese craftsmen had experimented with movable type as early as the 11th century, using ceramic pieces, and Korean printers had developed metal movable type by the 13th century. But these Asian innovations used characters from writing systems with thousands of different symbols, making the practical challenges enormous. European alphabetic writing, with just a few dozen letters, was far more suited to movable type. Still, knowing something is theoretically possible and actually making it work are very different challenges. Gutenberg's type was made of metal, specifically, a carefully formulated alloy of lead, about 80%, tin, about 10%, and antimony, about 10%. This combination was crucial. Pure lead was too soft and would wear out quickly. Tin added hardness. Antimony had a special property. Unlike most metals, which shrink when they cool, antimony expands slightly. This expansion meant the molten alloy would fill the mold completely, capturing every detail of the letter shape, and would form a tight, precise casting. The type itself was a small rectangular block of this metal alloy, about an inch tall. The exact size varied. At the top of the block was the raised, reversed image of a letter, reversed because it would print forward when pressed against paper. The bottom of the block was perfectly flat, so all the letters would sit at exactly the same height. The sides were perfectly square so letters could fit tightly together in lines. But how do you create hundreds or thousands of these metal letters, each one identical to every other example of the same letter? Gutenberg developed a sophisticated typecasting system. First, he would create a punch, a metal rod with a letter carved in relief at one end. This was precision work, requiring the skills of a goldsmith. The punch had to be carved with extraordinary accuracy because every error would be replicated in every piece of type cast from it. The hardened steel punch was then hammered into a softer piece of metal, usually copper, creating a matrix, an impression of the letter, now recessed. This matrix was fitted into an adjustable mold, a handheld device that could be opened to remove the cast type and adjusted to accommodate different widths of letters. To cast type, the mold was filled with molten metal alloy. The metal cooled and solidified in seconds. The mold was opened, the type was removed, and the process was repeated. A skilled worker could cast hundreds of letters per day. From a single matrix, thousands of identical pieces of type could be produced. Gutenberg needed multiple copies of each letter, many more of common letters like E and A, than of rare letters like Z or Q. He also created different versions of the same letter to better mimic the natural variation of manuscript writing. Several different forms of A or E, for instance. His typeface was modeled on the Gothic manuscript hand common in German religious books of the period, making his printed pages look as much like manuscript pages as possible. The result was a font, a complete set of type in a particular size and style, comprising several thousand individual pieces. These pieces of type could be composed, arranged into words and lines, locked into a form, printed, then disassembled and reused. The type was durable enough to be used thousands of times before wearing out. Now to the ink. As mentioned earlier, the water-based inks used by scribes wouldn't work for printing on metal. Gutenberg needed an ink that would adhere to metal, transfer cleanly to paper, dry relatively quickly, and produce a deep, permanent black. He developed an oil-based ink, drawing on techniques from oil painting which was becoming more sophisticated in 15th century Europe. The base was linseed oil or another drying oil. To this, he added soot or lamp black for color, and possibly varnish or other materials to get the right consistency. The exact formula remains something of a mystery, but the result was an ink that worked beautifully. It adhered to metal, transferred evenly, and dried to a rich black that has remained vivid for more than 500 years in surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible. The press itself was adapted from existing screw press technology. Wine presses and presses for extracting olive oil used a large screw to apply pressure. Gutenberg modified this design for printing. His press had a flat bed where the type was placed and a flat plate, the platen, that would press the paper against the ink type. The platen was raised and lowered by turning a large screw mechanism. To print a page, the worker would first ink the type using leather-covered balls filled with horsehair or wool. The ink balls were dabbed onto the type, covering all the raised surfaces evenly. A sheet of paper would be positioned precisely on the press bed, held in place by a frame. The pressman would then pull a lever, turning the screw and lowering the platen onto the paper, pressing it against the ink type with powerful, even force across the entire page. After a moment, the platen was raised, the printed page carefully removed and hung to dry, and the process would begin again for the next page. A good press team could print several hundred impressions per day, remarkable compared to a scribe's output of a few pages, but slow by later industrial standards. Remember, each page had to be individually placed in the press, pressed, and removed, and this was just for one side of the paper. After the first side dried, the sheets had to be printed again on the reverse. The paper itself deserves mention. Gutenberg used paper for most of his printing, though some copies of his Bible were printed on vellum for wealthy customers. Paper was relatively new to Europe, having been introduced from the Islamic world. By the mid-15th century, paper mills existed in Italy, France, and Germany. Paper was much cheaper than vellum, and crucially, the printing press needed so much paper that vellum would have been prohibitively expensive even if enough animals could have been slaughtered to supply the skin. But paper presented its own challenges. It had to be moistened before printing to make it more flexible and receptive to ink, then pressed and dried afterward. The quality varied, and Gutenberg had to ensure he was using paper that would accept ink evenly and last for centuries. The paper he used for the Gutenberg Bible has indeed lasted. Those pages are still white and flexible after more than 550 years. The typesetting process required its own specialized skills and organization. A compositor would work from a manuscript copy, selecting letters from type cases, organized boxes with compartments for each letter, and arranging them into words and lines. The lines were assembled in a composing stick, a handheld device that held several lines of type. When a page was complete, it was transferred to a metal frame that held all the type for one page tightly together. Spacing was crucial. The compositor had to ensure even spacing between words, and that each line was exactly the same length. justified. This was accomplished using spaces, blank pieces of metal of various widths that were inserted between words. Getting all this right required skill and judgment. A poorly composed page would look uneven and unprofessional. The type for me was then locked into place, ensuring nothing would shift during the violent process of printing. Imagine the force required to press paper against metal. If the type moved even slightly, the impression would be blurred. Everything had to be absolutely rigid and secure. The entire system was interdependent. The type mold only worked with the right alloy. The ink only worked with metal type and oil-based formula. The press only worked if the type was properly composed and secured. The paper had to be prepared correctly to accept the ink. Workers had to be trained in these entirely new processes. Every element had to function properly or nothing would work. This is why it took Gutenberg years of experimentation. He had to get everything right, not just functional, but producing results that would convince skeptics that printed books could equal or surpass manuscripts in quality. If the type was uneven, if the ink was blotchy, if the impression was too light or too heavy, if the pages were misaligned, the technology would be dismissed as interesting but impractical. And there was another challenge: economics. Gutenberg had to develop a system that wasn't just technically feasible but commercially viable. Setting up a printing shop required significant capital investment: the press, the metal for type, supplies of paper, the workshop space, the trained workers. Gutenberg had to demonstrate that this investment could be recouped through the sale of printed books that people would actually buy. This is where Fust's money came in. The 1,600 guilders Fust lent Gutenberg represented enormous capital, enough to set up a complete printing operation. But it was also a debt that would have to be repaid with interest. Gutenberg was gambling that his printed books would sell well enough to cover his costs and repay his creditors. It was a high-stakes venture, and Gutenberg was betting everything on his vision. By 1452 or 1453, everything was ready. The workshop was equipped. The type was cast. The press was functioning. Workers were trained. Paper was acquired. And Gutenberg began printing his masterpiece: a 2-volume Latin Bible that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that printing had arrived and that the world of manuscripts was ending. The Gutenberg Bible would not only prove that printing could work, it would show that printed books could be breathtakingly beautiful, rivaling the finest manuscripts. It would be the announcement, in 2 massive volumes of astonishing craftsmanship, that the future had arrived in Mainz. Around 1452, in his workshop in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg began work on the project that would justify years of experimentation, thousands of guilders of investment, and his absolute conviction that printing could change the world. He was going to print a Bible, not just any Bible, but one that would rival the most beautiful hand-illuminated manuscripts produced in Europe's finest scriptoriums. The choice of text was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the Bible was the most important book in Christian Europe, always in demand by churches, monasteries, and wealthy individuals. A printed Bible that could be sold at a fraction of the cost of a manuscript Bible would find eager buyers. Symbolic because the Bible represented the highest achievement of manuscript culture. To print a Bible was to announce that printing had arrived not as a poor substitute for manuscript production but as its equal or superior. The edition Gutenberg chose to print was the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation that had been the standard Bible in Western Christianity for 1,000 years. This was the Bible that priests read at Mass, that monks studied in their cells, that university theologians debated. Every educated person in Europe knew this text. Gutenberg planned an edition of extraordinary ambition. Each page would contain 2 columns of 42 lines each, hence the book's alternate name, the 42-line Bible. The pages would be large format, about 12 by 16 inches, creating an imposing volume. The complete Bible would fill 2 massive volumes, running to 1,282 pages. The scale of the project was staggering. This wasn't a pamphlet or a short text but a monumental work that would test every aspect of the printing system. The typeface Gutenberg designed for this Bible is itself a masterpiece. Modeled on the Gothic manuscript hand used in German liturgical books, it has a formal, dignified beauty. The letters are crisp and even, the spacing precise. Gutenberg included multiple variant forms of letters to create the slight variations found in manuscript writing. making the printed page feel alive and organic rather than mechanical. But here's what's truly remarkable. Gutenberg included over 290 different characters in his type font. Not just the 26 letters of the alphabet in upper and lower case, but numerous alternative forms, ligatures, combined letters like phi or st, abbreviations, and special characters. This variety allowed him to reproduce the complexity and richness of manuscript writing. Looking at a page of the Gutenberg Bible, your first impression might be that it's a particularly fine manuscript, not a printed book at all. The production process was immensely complex. First, the type had to be set. Compositors working from manuscript exemplars, setting letter by letter, line by line, page by page. For the 1,282 pages, with each page containing approximately 2,600 characters, they were composing over 3 million individual character positions. And remember, they couldn't set the entire Bible at once because they didn't have enough type. They would set a few pages, print them, then break down the type and reuse it for the next pages. The process took years. Gutenberg planned to print about 180 copies, around 150 on paper and perhaps 30 on vellum for wealthy customers who wanted the traditional luxury material. Even the paper copies required enormous quantities of paper. Each 2-volume set needed about 600 sheets, meaning the entire print run required over 100,000 sheets of paper. This had to be acquired, transported to Mainz, and stored properly. The printing itself was meticulous work. Each page had to be printed on both sides, requiring 2 separate press runs. The paper had to be dampened before printing to make it receptive to ink, then carefully positioned on the press. The type had to be inked evenly. The pressure had to be just right. Too little and the impression would be faint, too much and the paper might tear or the impression might blur. After printing, each sheet had to be hung to dry. The inking was done using leather-covered ink balls, dabbed onto the type between each impression. This required skill to ensure even coverage without over-applying. The pressman operated the press itself, positioning each sheet, pulling the lever to lower the platen, and carefully removing the printed sheet. It was physically demanding work requiring both strength and delicacy. Spacing was crucial. The compositor had to ensure even spacing between words and that each line was exactly the same length, justified. This was accomplished using spaces, blank pieces of metal of various widths that were inserted between words. Getting all this right required skill and judgment. A poorly composed page would look uneven and unprofessional. The type for me was then locked into place, ensuring nothing would shift during the violent process of printing. Imagine the force required to press paper against metal. If the type moved even slightly, the impression would be blurred. Everything had to be absolutely rigid and secure. The entire system was interdependent. The type mold only worked with the right alloy. The ink only worked with metal type and oil-based formula. The press only worked if the type was properly composed and secured. The paper had to be prepared correctly to accept the ink. Workers had to be trained in these entirely new processes. Every element had to function properly or nothing would work. This is why it took Gutenberg years of experimentation. He had to get everything right, not just functional, but producing results that would convince skeptics that printed books could equal or surpass manuscripts in quality. If the type was uneven, if the ink was blotchy, if the impression was too light or too heavy, if the pages were misaligned, the technology would be dismissed as interesting but impractical. And there was another challenge: economics. Gutenberg had to develop a system that wasn't just technically feasible but commercially viable. Setting up a printing shop required significant capital investment: the press, the metal for type, supplies of paper, the workshop space, the trained workers. Gutenberg had to demonstrate that this investment could be recouped through the sale of printed books that people would actually buy. This is where Fust's money came in. The 1,600 guilders Fust lent Gutenberg represented enormous capital, enough to set up a complete printing operation. But it was also a debt that would have to be repaid with interest. Gutenberg was gambling that his printed books would sell well enough to cover his costs and repay his creditors. It was a high-stakes venture, and Gutenberg was betting everything on his vision. By 1452 or 1453, everything was ready. The workshop was equipped. The type was cast. The press was functioning. Workers were trained. Paper was acquired. and Gutenberg began printing his masterpiece. A 2-volume Latin Bible that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that printing had arrived and that the world of manuscripts was ending. The Gutenberg Bible would not only prove that printing could work, it would show that printed books could be breathtakingly beautiful, rivaling the finest manuscripts. It would be the announcement, in 2 massive volumes of astonishing craftsmanship, that the future had arrived in Mainz. Around 1452, in his workshop in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg began work on the project that would justify years of experimentation, thousands of guilders of investment, and his absolute conviction that printing could change the world. He was going to print a Bible, not just any Bible, but one that would rival the most beautiful hand-illuminated manuscripts produced in Europe's finest scriptoriums. The choice of text was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the Bible was the most important book in Christian Europe, always in demand by churches, monasteries, and wealthy individuals. A printed Bible that could be sold at a fraction of the cost of a manuscript Bible would find eager buyers. Symbolic because the Bible represented the highest achievement of manuscript culture. To print a Bible was to announce that printing had arrived not as a poor substitute for manuscript production but as its equal or superior. The edition Gutenberg chose to print was the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin translation that had been the standard Bible in Western Christianity for 1,000 years. This was the Bible that priests read at Mass, that monks studied in their cells, that university theologians debated. Every educated person in Europe knew this text. Gutenberg planned an edition of extraordinary ambition. Each page would contain 2 columns of 42 lines each, hence the book's alternate name, the 42-line Bible. The pages would be large format, about 12 by 16 inches, creating an imposing volume. The complete Bible would fill 2 massive volumes, running to 1,282 pages. The scale of the project was staggering. This wasn't a pamphlet or a short text but a monumental work that would test every aspect of the printing system. The typeface Gutenberg designed for this Bible is itself a masterpiece. Modeled on the Gothic manuscript hand used in German liturgical books, it has a formal, dignified beauty. The letters are crisp and even the spacing precise. Gutenberg included multiple variant forms of letters to create the slight variations found in manuscript writing, making the printed page feel alive and organic rather than mechanical. But here's what's truly remarkable. Gutenberg included over 290 different characters in his type font. Not just the 26 letters of the alphabet in upper and lower case, but numerous alternative forms, ligatures, combined letters like phi or st, abbreviations, and special characters. This variety allowed him to reproduce the complexity and richness of manuscript writing. Looking at a page of the Gutenberg Bible, your first impression might be that it's a particularly fine manuscript, not a printed book at all. The production process was immensely complex. First, the type had to be set. Compositors working from manuscript exemplars, setting letter by letter, line by line, page by page. For the 1,282 pages, with each page containing approximately 2,600 characters, they were composing over 3 million individual character positions. And remember, they couldn't set the entire Bible at once because they didn't have enough type. They would set a few pages, print them, then break down the type and reuse it for the next pages. The process took years. Gutenberg planned to print about 180 copies, around 150 on paper and perhaps 30 on vellum for wealthy customers who wanted the traditional luxury material. Even the paper copies required enormous quantities of paper. Each 2-volume set needed about 600 sheets, meaning the entire print run required over 100,000 sheets of paper. This had to be acquired, transported to Mainz, and stored properly. The printing itself was meticulous work. Each page had to be printed on both sides, requiring 2 separate press runs. The paper had to be dampened before printing to make it receptive to ink, then carefully positioned on the press. The type had to be inked evenly. The pressure had to be just right. Too little and the impression would be faint, too much and the paper might tear or the impression might blur. After printing, each sheet had to be hung to dry. The inking was done using leather-covered ink balls, dabbed onto the type between each impression. This required skill to ensure even coverage without over-applying. The pressman operated the press itself, positioning each sheet, pulling the lever to lower the platen, and carefully removing the printed sheet. It was physically demanding work requiring both strength and delicacy. Fourth, there was no effective way to prevent the technology from spreading. Unlike some guild secrets that could be closely guarded within a single city, printing required too many workers and too much activity to keep secret. Once established, a printing workshop was necessarily visible. Customers came to place orders. Finished books were distributed. The sound of the press could be heard. Other craftsmen could observe, deduce, and imitate. The spread began in Germany. By the 1460s, presses operated in Strasbourg, Cologne, Basel, Augsburg, Nuremberg, and other German cities. German printers dominated the early industry, taking their skills to other countries. Printing was established in Italy by 1465, in Switzerland by 1468, in France and the Netherlands by 1470, in Spain by 1472, in England by 1476, in Scandinavia by the 1480s, and in Portugal by 1487. By 1500, printing presses operated in over 250 cities and towns across Europe. Different cities became centers of printing excellence, each with its own character and specialties. Venice emerged as perhaps the greatest printing center of the early period. By the 1490s, Venice had over 150 printing establishments and was producing more books than any other city in Europe. Venetian printers were innovative and commercially aggressive. They printed in multiple languages: Latin, Italian, Greek, Hebrew, serving diverse markets. They established distribution networks throughout Europe and even into the Ottoman Empire. The most famous Venetian printer was Aldus Manutius, whose Aldine press, founded in 1494, revolutionized book design. Aldus had several crucial innovations. He developed italic type, a condensed, slanted typeface based on humanist handwriting, which allowed more text per page and reduced costs. He pioneered the small format portable book, creating editions that could fit in a pocket or saddlebag rather than requiring a reading desk. His editions of classical Greek and Latin texts were scholarly, accurate, and affordable, making classical learning accessible to a much broader audience. Aldus also introduced the modern concept of the publisher. He didn't just print books to order but planned editions, acquired texts, employed scholars to edit them, designed attractive formats, and marketed the results. The anchor and dolphin symbol of the Aldine press became a mark of quality recognized across Europe. Aldus demonstrated that printing could be not just a craft but an intellectual and cultural enterprise. Paris became another major center, with dozens of printing houses by the 1480s. The university provided a ready market for textbooks and scholarly works. Parisian printers produced theological works, classical texts, and increasingly, books in French rather than Latin. The Estienne family became particularly prominent, producing scholarly editions and elegant typography that rivaled the Italians. In Germany, cities like Augsburg and Nuremberg developed significant printing industries. Anton Koberger's workshop in Nuremberg employed over 100 workers and operated 24 presses by the 1490s, making it one of Europe's largest printing operations. German printers were particularly adept at illustrated books, developing the art of the woodcut illustration to high sophistication. England came relatively late to printing. William Caxton, an English merchant who had learned printing in Cologne, established the first English press in Westminster in 1476. Caxton printed the first books in English, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and many translations from French and Latin. His work established English as a literary language and helped standardize English spelling and usage. Spain and Portugal, though slower to adopt printing, eventually developed significant industries, printing in Castilian, Catalan, Portuguese, and Hebrew for Jewish communities. The Spanish printing industry would become particularly important for producing books for the Spanish colonial empire in the Americas. What were these early printers producing? The output was remarkably diverse, reflecting the varied demands of the reading public. Religious texts dominated, especially in the first decades. Bibles, of course, but also psalters, prayer books, books of hours, devotional texts for lay people, missals for celebrating Mass, and commentaries on Scripture. The Church was the largest book-buying institution, and religious devotion created strong demand from individual buyers. Interestingly, Printing quickly led to standardization of religious texts. When every Bible was hand-copied, variation was inevitable. Once printed, a text could be reproduced identically thousands of times. The Church could ensure that liturgical texts used in different parishes were exactly the same. This standardization had profound implications, making variations and errors more visible and eventually contributing to religious controversies. Classical texts were another major category. The Renaissance recovery of classical learning created enormous demand for Greek and Roman authors. Printers produced editions of Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and dozens of others. These editions made classical learning accessible beyond the narrow circle of scholars with access to manuscript libraries. A student could now own copies of the texts he was studying, revolutionizing education. Legal texts were crucial: law codes, collections of legal opinions, legal commentaries. Lawyers needed access to texts, and the standardization of legal texts through printing helped create more consistent legal systems. Medical texts, philosophical works, and scientific treatises also found eager markets among educated professionals. Contemporary scholarship was published, new works of theology, philosophy, history, and poetry. For the first time, a scholar could write a book and see it distributed in hundreds or thousands of copies across Europe within months. This would prove revolutionary for the development of knowledge, allowing ideas to spread and be debated on a scale previously impossible. Popular literature expanded dramatically. Almanacs, calendars, and books of astrological predictions were bestsellers. Romance literature, tales of chivalry, collections of proverbs and moral instruction, books of practical advice, all found audiences. Printing made books available to those who could never afford manuscripts, creating new reading publics. One surprising category: indulgences. The Catholic Church sold indulgences, certificates promising reduced time in purgatory in exchange for donations. These single-sheet documents were needed in huge quantities, and printing made them cheap to produce. Gutenberg himself may have printed indulgences even before his Bible. The irony is profound. Printing first served the Catholic Church's financial interests, then enabled the Reformation that would split that church. Pamphlets and broadsheets emerged as new forms. Short texts of just a few pages could be printed quickly and cheaply, distributed widely, and responded to rapidly. This created new possibilities for debate, controversy, and the spread of news. Printing made possible a kind of public discourse that couldn't exist in manuscript culture. Illustrated books became increasingly sophisticated. Woodcut illustrations could be integrated with text, allowing for illustrated technical manuals, herbals, books of medicinal plants, maps, and scientific diagrams. Later, copperplate engraving would allow even finer detail. The combination of image and text in printed books would prove powerful for education and scientific communication. The printing industry developed its own infrastructure and culture. Type foundries specialized in casting type and selling it to printers. Papermakers expanded production to meet demand. Ink makers developed better formulas. Binderies bound the printed sheets into finished books. Book dealers specialized in selling and distributing books, developing trade networks across Europe. Print shops became cultural centers. Scholars might visit to consult with printers about editions of classical texts. Authors would work with printers on their manuscripts. Intellectual discussion happened in printing houses, which combined the functions of workshop, publisher's office, bookshop, and informal gathering place for the learned. By 1500, just half a century after the Gutenberg Bible, somewhere between 6 and 15 million books had been printed in Europe. This is an astounding number when you consider that in 1450, the entire continent probably held fewer than 100,000 manuscript books in all its libraries and private collections combined. In 50 years, the number of books in Europe had increased 100-fold or more. This flood of books meant that knowledge that had been rare and precious became, if not commonplace, at least accessible. A modest scholar or even a prosperous merchant could now own a personal library of dozens of books. University students could own the textbooks they needed. Parish priests could own service books. Lawyers could consult legal texts. Doctors could reference medical authorities. What had been the privilege of the very wealthy and the institutional libraries was becoming available to anyone with education and modest means. The standardization of texts meant that scholars in different cities, different countries, could study exactly the same text and discuss it with precision. If a scholar in Paris discovered an error in line 47 of page 23 of a classical text, a colleague in Venice could consult his copy and see the same error. This seems obvious to us, but it was revolutionary then. It made possible a new kind of collaborative, cumulative scholarship. The speed of dissemination meant that new ideas could spread rapidly. A book printed in one city could reach readers across Europe within weeks or months. Discoveries, innovations, and controversies could become widely known in a time frame unimaginable in manuscript culture. The printing revolution was not just quantitative but qualitative. It wasn't merely that there were more books, but that the nature of knowledge, learning, and intellectual life was fundamentally transformed. The world of manuscripts, which had existed for over a millennium, vanished in 2 generations, replaced by a print culture that would dominate for the next 5 centuries. And this was just the beginning. The most dramatic consequences of printing, the religious revolution of the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the political transformations were yet to come. But they were all made possible by this rapid spread of printing technology across Europe in the last decades of the 15th century. The flood of books unleashed by the printing press didn't just make existing knowledge more accessible. It fundamentally transformed how knowledge was created, validated, shared, and understood. To grasp the full impact of printing, we need to look beyond the obvious fact that books became more numerous and consider how printing changed the very nature of knowledge and intellectual life. Begin with standardization, perhaps the most important yet least obvious consequence of printing. When books were manuscript, no 2 copies were identical. Scribal errors, variations in abbreviations, differences in layout, every manuscript was unique. If you and a colleague were discussing a text, you couldn't be certain you were reading exactly the same words. Discrepancies between manuscripts created enormous problems for scholars trying to establish definitive versions of texts. Printing changed this completely. Every copy of a printed edition was identical, barring damage or printing errors that affected only a few copies. For the first time in history, thousands of people could read exactly the same text simultaneously. You could cite page and line numbers with confidence that readers consulting their copies would find the same passage in the same place. This standardization enabled new forms of scholarship. Scholars could collaborate at a distance with precision. They could debate interpretations knowing they were working from the same text. They could identify and correct errors systematically, with corrections incorporated into subsequent editions. The concept of a definitive edition became possible. A carefully edited text that would serve as the standard for scholarly work. Classical scholarship was transformed. Renaissance humanists were recovering ancient Greek and Roman texts, but manuscript transmission had introduced countless errors over centuries of copying. Scholars like Desiderius Erasmus could now produce printed editions that corrected errors, reconciled variant manuscripts, and established reliable texts. Erasmus's 1516 Greek New Testament was revolutionary. It showed that the Vulgate, the Latin Bible used for 1,000 years, contained translation errors. This discovery, made possible by printing, would fuel theological controversies and contribute to the Reformation. The standardization extended beyond text to other forms of information. Maps could be printed with precise detail, allowing navigators to share knowledge of coastlines and routes. Mathematical notation could be standardized, allowing mathematicians to communicate complex ideas without ambiguity. Musical notation in printed form allowed compositions to spread rapidly and be performed identically in different locations. Botanical illustrations in herbals could show precisely what a plant looked like, aiding identification and medical use. But printing did more than standardize existing knowledge. It accelerated the creation of new knowledge through improved scholarly communication. In manuscript culture, a scholar's work might reach a few dozen people at most. With printing, hundreds or thousands could read it. This created new possibilities for collaborative scholarship and cumulative progress. Consider how scientific knowledge advanced. Before printing, a scientist's discoveries might be known only locally or might be lost entirely. With printing, discoveries could be published and disseminated widely. Other scientists could replicate experiments, verify results, build on findings, or challenge errors. The scientific method as we know it, with its emphasis on reproducibility, peer review, and cumulative knowledge, was only possible in a print culture. The development of modern mathematics illustrates this perfectly. Mathematical innovation requires building on previous work, using established notation and methods. In manuscript culture, mathematical knowledge spread slowly and unreliably. With printing, mathematical treatises could reach other mathematicians quickly. Innovations in algebra, geometry, and calculus spread across Europe, allowing rapid progress. By the 17th century, mathematicians like Descartes, Fermat, Pascal, Leibniz, and Newton were building on each other's work at a pace impossible in earlier centuries. Printing also made possible the concept of intellectual property and authorship as we understand it. In manuscript culture, texts were copied freely. The concept of an author's ownership of their words was weak. With printing, the author-publisher relationship developed. Authors contracted with printers to publish their works. Printers invested capital in editions and wanted protection from pirated editions. This led to privileges and licenses, early forms of copyright, that recognized authors' and publishers' rights. The result was the emergence of professional authorship. For the first time, it became possible, if not easy, to make a living by writing. Authors could reach markets large enough to provide income. This encouraged writing and the production of new knowledge. The Republic of Letters, the international community of scholars and writers, flourished in the print age in ways impossible before. The democratization of knowledge was profound, though it should not be overstated. Books became cheaper, but they were still expensive by the standards of working people. Literacy rates increased but remained modest well into the 18th century in most of Europe. Access to books was still shaped by wealth, education, and social position. Nevertheless, printing created new reading publics. The emergence of vernacular printing was crucial here. Early printing was dominated by Latin, the language of the church, universities, and educated elite. But printers quickly realized that larger markets existed for books in vernacular languages. By 1500, roughly half of all printed books were in vernacular rather than Latin. This shift had enormous implications. Books in German, Italian, French, English, Spanish, and other languages were accessible to those educated only in their native tongue, a much larger group than those who knew Latin. Merchants, craftsmen, lower clergy, and women, who were less likely to learn Latin, could now access printed material. The reading public expanded from thousands to hundreds of thousands and eventually millions. Vernacular printing also strengthened national languages and cultures. Printed books in the vernacular standardized spelling, grammar, and usage. Regional dialects gave way to standard national languages. Luther's German Bible, printed in huge quantities, did much to establish modern High German. The King James Bible would similarly influence English. Printed literature created national literary cultures and contributed to the development of national consciousness. Self-education became possible in ways it never had been before. An ambitious person with sufficient literacy and modest means could acquire books and learn independently. This was revolutionary. In manuscript culture, access to learning required access to institutional libraries or wealthy patrons. With printing, knowledge could be pursued privately, without institutional gatekeeping. Technical knowledge spread more effectively. Practical manuals on topics like navigation, surveying, bookkeeping, mining, metallurgy, military engineering, and agriculture could be printed and distributed. Skilled craftsmen could share their knowledge beyond direct apprenticeship. This contributed to technological development and economic growth. Reference works became possible. Dictionaries defining and standardizing language, encyclopedias organizing knowledge systematically, bibliographies listing available books. These tools for navigating the expanding world of knowledge only made sense in print culture. Manuscript copies would be out of date almost immediately. Printed reference works could be updated in new editions and widely distributed. The concept of intellectual progress itself was strengthened by printing. When knowledge was locked in rare manuscripts in scattered libraries, it was difficult to see clear progress. Discoveries might be lost, earlier insights forgotten, the same ground covered repeatedly. With printing creating cumulative, accessible knowledge, progress became visible. Each generation could build on the last. The idea that human knowledge was advancing, that we knew more than our ancestors and our descendants would know more than us, this modern notion was reinforced by the visible accumulation of printed knowledge. Educational institutions were transformed. Universities had functioned through lectures and oral examination because books were too rare for students to own. With printed textbooks, education could be more efficient. Students could study independently, refer back to texts, and master more material. The curriculum could become more sophisticated and standardized. Literacy itself began its long march toward universality. As books became more common and affordable, as more professions required reading, as the benefits of literacy became more obvious, pressure increased to expand education. This was a slow process. Universal literacy wouldn't be achieved in most of Europe until the 19th century, but printing made it imaginable and eventually achievable. Yet this transformation of knowledge had troubling aspects. The church and secular authorities quickly realized that printing was dangerous. Ideas that challenged religious orthodoxy or political authority could now spread rapidly and widely. Controlling knowledge became much harder. Censorship became more urgent but also more difficult to enforce. The same technology that spread learning also spread error, superstition, and dangerous ideas. Printed books had an authority that handwritten texts lacked. The mechanical nature of printing suggested objectivity and reliability. But printed books could contain errors, biases, and outright lies just as readily as truth. The problem of evaluating sources, of distinguishing reliable knowledge from misinformation, became more acute. The sheer volume of printed material created new challenges. By the late 16th century, scholars were complaining about information overload. There were too many books to read, too much new material to keep up with. The anxiety about being overwhelmed by information, which we associate with the internet age, was already present in early modern Europe. Still, the overall trajectory was unmistakable. Knowledge was being democratized, standardized, accumulated, and accelerated. The transformation from manuscript culture to print culture fundamentally altered human intellectual life. The consequences would unfold over centuries, as printing made possible religious revolutions, scientific breakthroughs, political transformations, and the emergence of the modern world. The printing press didn't just copy books, it transformed how humans think together, how knowledge is created and shared, how truth is established and challenged. Gutenberg's invention was not merely technological but epistemological, changing not just how we store information but how we know what we know. On October 31, 1517, Martin Luther, an obscure German monk and theology professor, reportedly nailed a document containing 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This act of academic protest against the church's sale of indulgences would likely have remained a local dispute, discussed among theologians and perhaps brought to the attention of church authorities for quiet resolution. But this was 1517, not 1417. The printing press had transformed the landscape of communication. Within 2 weeks, Luther's theses had been translated from Latin into German and printed. Within 2 months, they had spread across Germany. Within 3 months, they were circulating throughout Europe. The Reformation had begun, and it would have been impossible without the printing press. Luther himself recognized this. He called printing God's highest and extremest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward. This was not mere rhetoric. The Protestant Reformation was fundamentally a print phenomenon, the first mass media event in history, driven by the rapid reproduction and distribution of controversial texts. Consider the numbers. Between 1517 and 1520, Luther published some 30 tracts and treatises. These were printed in multiple editions by different printers, with individual works appearing in dozens of reprints. In those 3 years, Luther's writings probably accounted for a third of all books sold in Germany. By 1520, an estimated 300,000 copies of Luther's works were in circulation. An astonishing figure given that Germany's population was perhaps 15 million and literacy was limited. These weren't massive theological tomes but short, punchy pamphlets written in vigorous German rather than scholarly Latin. Luther wrote for ordinary people, merchants, artisans, minor clergy, not just for academic theologians. His style was direct, sometimes crude, often humorous, always forceful. He used vernacular idioms and popular expressions. He attacked opponents with savage wit. His writings were entertaining as well as theologically revolutionary. Printers loved Luther. His works sold in vast quantities. When a new Luther text arrived at a print shop, printers would rush it into production, knowing it would sell out quickly. Other printers would pirate the text, producing unauthorized editions to meet demand. The economics of printing meant that controversial, popular material was extremely profitable. Luther made many printers wealthy, but Luther was just the beginning. The Reformation unleashed an explosion of religious printing. Supporters of Luther and of other reformers, Zwingli in Zurich, Calvin in Geneva, various radical reformers across Germany and Switzerland, published tracts, sermons, biblical commentaries, and polemical attacks on opponents. The Catholic Church responded with its own flood of printed material defending traditional doctrine and attacking Protestant heresies. The result was a print war. Thousands of pamphlets arguing every aspect of theology, biblical interpretation, church practice, and religious authority. This debate was conducted not in Latin for scholars but in German, French, English, and other vernaculars for the general literate public. Religious controversy became a form of popular entertainment, with pamphlets sold in markets, read aloud in taverns, and eagerly discussed by people who previously would have had no access to theological debate. The pamphlet wars were often crude and vicious. Reformers depicted the Pope as the Antichrist in illustrated broadsides. Catholic polemicists portrayed Luther as a demon or a drunken fool. Sexual scandals, real or invented, were detailed in print. Conspiracy theories flourished. Rumors spread at print speed. The tone of religious debate coarsened as controversial material found eager audiences. But amid the vulgarity and vituperation, serious theological issues were being debated publicly for the first time. The authority of Scripture versus tradition, the nature of salvation, the role of good works, the meaning of the sacraments, the proper organization of the Church. These fundamental questions were discussed not just by trained theologians but by anyone who could read or listen to someone reading. Central to the Reformation was the printed Bible in vernacular languages. Luther's German translation, first published in 1522, New Testament, and 1534, Complete Bible, was a publishing phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands of copies were printed in various editions. For the first time, Germans could read the Bible in their own language without depending on clergy to interpret Latin text. This fundamentally challenged church authority. Catholic doctrine held that Scripture should be interpreted by the Church, with tradition and church teaching providing the proper understanding. If every individual could read the Bible independently, who would prevent wrong interpretations? The Catholic fear was precisely what happened. Different readers reached different conclusions, producing the theological diversity and fragmentation that characterized Protestantism. Other vernacular Bibles followed. Tyndale's English translation, the French translations of Lefebvre and Olivetan, the Swedish translation, all made Scripture directly accessible to populations previously dependent on Latin Bibles read by clergy. The social and religious impact was profound. Bible reading became a popular activity. Families gathered for Scripture reading. Literacy increased as people wanted to read God's Word for themselves. Printed Protestant hymnals allowed congregational singing in the vernacular, replacing Latin chants sung by clergy. Luther wrote hymns, and Protestant services became participatory in ways Catholic services were not. The printing of catechisms, simple question-and-answer texts explaining Protestant doctrine, allowed systematic religious education of children and new converts. The Catholic Church understood the danger. The Index of Forbidden Books, first issued in 1559, listed printed works Catholics were forbidden to read, including all Protestant materials and vernacular Bibles without proper authorization. Booksellers could be punished for carrying forbidden books. Readers could face penalties for possessing them. Enforcement varied by region, but the attempt at censorship was systematic. Yet censorship proved largely ineffective. Books banned in one territory could be printed in another and smuggled across borders. Clandestine presses operated despite prohibitions. Texts circulated in manuscript copies when printing was too dangerous. The decentralized nature of printing, with presses scattered across hundreds of cities in multiple political jurisdictions, made comprehensive censorship impossible. The Catholic Counter-Reformation used printing as well. Jesuit educators produced textbooks and devotional literature. The Church published authorized catechisms, saints' lives, and apologetic works defending Catholic doctrine. Illustrated works exploited printing's capacity for reproducing images, using art to teach and inspire. Catholic printing was often of higher quality than Protestant printing, more expensive, more beautifully produced, reflecting the Church's greater resources. But Catholics faced a disadvantage. Protestant emphasis on Scripture alone, sola scriptura, and individual reading of the Bible aligned perfectly with print culture. Catholicism's emphasis on tradition, hierarchy, and church authority fitted awkwardly with a technology that enabled individual access to texts and undermined clerical monopoly on interpretation. The religious wars that devastated much of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries were fought with weapons and armies, but they were also fought with printed words. Both sides used printing to recruit support, maintain morale, demonize opponents, and explain their causes. Religious pamphlets were propaganda tools, shaping public opinion and justifying violence. The Reformation also demonstrated printing's capacity for rapid mobilization around controversial ideas. In manuscript culture, new religious movements could be suppressed before spreading widely. With printing, suppression became much harder. Ideas could spread faster than authorities could react. By the time the Church fully recognized the threat Luther posed, his ideas had reached an audience of hundreds of thousands. This pattern would repeat with other movements. When an idea found a popular audience, printing could spread it rapidly, creating movements that challenged established authority. The technology was inherently destabilizing, favoring change over stability, challengers over establishments, diversity over uniformity. The Reformation's success in Northern Europe and failure in Southern Europe had many causes: political, economic, social, but printing played a crucial role. Protestant ideas spread most successfully where literacy was relatively high, where printers were numerous and independent of church control, where political authorities were willing to tolerate or encourage religious challenge. In Italy and Spain, where the church and political authorities maintained tighter control over printing, Protestantism made little headway. By fragmenting Western Christianity, the Reformation ended the religious unity that had characterized medieval Europe. No longer was there a single church under papal authority but multiple Protestant denominations alongside Catholicism, each claiming truth and denouncing the others. This pluralism, however unwelcome to contemporaries, would eventually contribute to religious tolerance and freedom of conscience, values central to modernity. The Reformation showed that printing was not merely a tool for spreading existing knowledge but a force that could catalyze radical change. The technology enabled challenges to authority, rapid mobilization of support, and the formation of new communities united by shared texts and ideas rather than by geographical proximity. These capacities would prove revolutionary in politics and science as well as in religion. While religious controversies raged across Europe, another transformation was underway, one that would ultimately reshape human understanding of nature and the universe. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was enabled, in large measure, by the printing press. Without printing, modern science as we know it would have been impossible. To understand why, consider what science requires: accurate observation, precise measurement, mathematical description, experimental testing, and crucially, the accumulation and sharing of knowledge across time and distance. All of these depend on reliable communication. Scientists must be able to share their findings, build on others' work, and collaborate even when separated by hundreds of miles. Printing made this possible in ways manuscript culture never could. The revolution began with astronomy. Nicholas Copernicus developed his heliocentric model, placing the sun rather than the Earth at the center of the universe, through decades of private study. His great work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, was printed in 1543, just before his death. This book contained detailed mathematical descriptions, diagrams, and astronomical tables that would have been nearly impossible to transmit accurately in manuscript. Copernicus's theory was revolutionary but initially had limited impact. The book was mathematically difficult, printed in small quantities, and challenged deeply held beliefs about the cosmos and humanity's place in it. But it was available to be studied, debated, and eventually built upon. Later astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler could work with Copernicus's precise tables and calculations, confident they were reading what he actually wrote. Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, On the Fabric of the Human Body, also published in 1543, revolutionized anatomy through detailed, accurate illustrations of human anatomy based on actual dissection rather than ancient authorities. These magnificent woodcut illustrations could be reproduced identically in every copy, allowing medical students across Europe to study from the same images. The precision of printed anatomical illustration enabled systematic improvement in medical knowledge. Galileo Galilei used printing strategically in the early 17th century. His telescopic observations of the Moon, Jupiter's satellites, and other celestial phenomena were published in Sidereus Nuncius, Starry Messenger, in 1610. This short book created a sensation. Printed quickly and distributed widely, it brought Galileo's discoveries to the attention of scholars and the educated public across Europe within months. Galileo understood public opinion's importance. When he defended the Copernican system in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, 1632, he wrote in Italian rather than Latin, making his arguments accessible to educated laypeople, not just scholars. This was a deliberate attempt to shift the debate beyond academic and clerical circles. The Church, recognizing the danger, placed him under house arrest and banned the book. But printed copies circulated anyway, and Galileo's arguments reached the audience he intended. The speed of communication that printing enabled accelerated scientific progress dramatically. When the telescope was invented in the Netherlands in 1608, word spread rapidly through Europe. Within months, Galileo had built his own improved version and begun making discoveries. Other astronomers quickly followed. News of improvements and discoveries circulated through printed letters, pamphlets, and books. What might have taken decades to spread in manuscript culture happened in months or a few years. Mathematical notation developed and standardized through printing. The symbols we use for addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, equals, and other operations were gradually adopted across Europe because they appeared in printed mathematical texts. René Descartes' algebraic notation, published in his Geometry, 1637, became standard because the books circulated widely. Isaac Newton's calculus notation differed from Gottfried Leibniz's, and the resulting confusion showed the importance of standardization. Eventually, Leibniz's notation prevailed partly because it appeared in more widely distributed texts. Scientific journals emerged as crucial institutions for sharing knowledge. The first, the Journal des Sçavans, Paris, and the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, London, both began publishing in 1665. These journals allowed scientists to publish shorter pieces describing experiments, observations, and theories without waiting to accumulate enough material for a book. Publication established priority of discovery. The first to print a finding received credit. The journal system created modern scientific communication. Rapid publication, peer review, informal at first, later systematized, cumulative knowledge building on previous work, and international scientific community connected by printed publications. Scientists read journals to learn what colleagues were discovering, published to share their own work, and engaged in debates through printed articles and responses. Replication of experiments became possible and important. When Robert Boyle published his experiments with the air pump in 1660, other scientists could read his detailed descriptions, build their own apparatus, and attempt to replicate his results. The verification or falsification of claims through replication depended on precise communication of methods and results, something printing enabled but manuscript culture couldn't reliably provide. Illustrations were crucial for science. Diagrams of experimental apparatus, drawings of specimens, maps, star charts, anatomical illustrations, all required accurate reproduction. Woodcut illustrations and later copperplate engravings allowed scientific works to include visual information that was essential for understanding and reproducing findings. Herbals, books describing medicinal plants, exemplify printing's impact. Manuscript herbals often had crude illustrations that degraded with each copying. Printed herbals could include detailed, accurate illustrations showing precisely which plant was meant. This improved medical practice and botanical knowledge. Each edition could incorporate corrections and new information, creating cumulative improvement. The concept of intellectual property in science developed alongside printing. Scientists wanted credit for their discoveries, leading to priority disputes, bitter arguments about who first made a discovery. These disputes were only possible because printing created dated, public records. Newton and Leibniz famously disputed priority for inventing calculus, with publication dates being crucial evidence. Scientific societies emerged partly to manage scientific communication. The Royal Society in London, founded 1660, and the Académie des Sciences in Paris, founded 1666, served as clearinghouses for scientific information, publishing journals and books, maintaining libraries, and facilitating correspondence among members. These institutions formalized the scientific community that printing had made possible. The Republic of Letters, the informal international network of scholars exchanging ideas through correspondence and printed works, flourished in the 17th century. Scientists wrote letters that were often copied and circulated, and sometimes published. Through this network, scholars in different countries collaborated, debated, and built on each other's work. The network transcended political and religious boundaries, united by shared commitment to knowledge. Printing also spread practical knowledge crucial for technological development. Mining techniques, metallurgy, navigation, surveying, fortification design, ballistics, all were subjects of printed technical manuals that spread specialized knowledge beyond craft guilds' closed circles. This contributed to technological innovation and economic development. However, printing also spread errors, outdated ideas, and pseudoscience. Astrological texts, alchemical treatises, and medical works based on ancient authorities rather than observation were printed alongside genuine scientific advances. The problem of distinguishing reliable knowledge from nonsense was acute, leading to the development of standards for evidence and argument that characterize modern science. By the late 17th century, when Newton published his Principia Mathematica, 1687, synthesizing a century of scientific work into a comprehensive mathematical physics, the transformation was complete. Newton could build on Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, and many others because their work was available in print. His own monumental achievement was published, distributed, studied, debated, and ultimately accepted because printing allowed this complex, mathematical work to reach the scientific community. The scientific revolution created the foundation for the modern world. Technology, medicine, our understanding of nature, even our philosophical worldview, all stem from this transformation. And this revolution was enabled by printing, which allowed knowledge to accumulate, be verified, and spread in ways impossible in manuscript culture. Gutenberg's press, invented to print Bibles, ended up enabling humanity to read the book of nature. Beyond religion and science, printing transformed nearly every aspect of European social and cultural life. The effects rippled through society, changing how people thought about themselves, their communities, their governments, and their world. The emergence of public opinion as a concept and force was directly connected to printing. In manuscript culture, opinion was local and fragmented. With printing, ideas could reach large audiences simultaneously. People across a region or nation could read the same texts, discuss the same issues, and develop shared views. Political pamphlets, news sheets, and controversial books created public discourse on topics that had previously been discussed only among elites. Coffee houses in the 17th and 18th centuries became centers of this new public sphere. Men, these were male spaces, would gather to drink coffee, read newspapers and pamphlets, and discuss current affairs. In London, coffee houses were nicknamed penny universities because for a penny, the price of coffee, you could participate in informed discussion. This culture of debate and discussion was sustained by printed material. Political pamphlets became powerful tools. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, hundreds of pamphlets argued every aspect of political and religious controversy. The explosion of printed political argument was unprecedented. For the first time, ordinary people could read detailed arguments about constitutional issues, religious settlement, and the proper limits of royal authority. This politicization of the general public was enabled by cheap print. Newspapers emerged gradually from news sheets and pamphlets. By the 17th century, regular news publications appeared in several European cities, providing current information about wars, politics, trade, and other matters. These early newspapers created an informed public aware of events beyond their immediate localities. The news business became a commercial enterprise, with news-gathering networks, correspondence in various cities, and regular publication schedules. Literature was transformed. The novel as an art form emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, made possible by printing's capacity to reach large audiences. Novels were written in vernacular languages for entertainment and were sold to middle-class readers who could afford books but weren't classical scholars. Works like Don Quixote, Robinson Crusoe, and Tom Jones created a new literary culture. Poetry reached broader audiences than ever before. Shakespeare's plays, written for performance, were also published and read. Poets like John Donne and Andrew Marvell became known through printed collections. The idea of a national literature, English literature, French literature, depended on printed texts creating shared cultural reference points. Drama flourished partly because printed plays allowed wider circulation of texts. Playwrights could publish their works, reaching audiences beyond those who saw performances. This created a literary reputation separate from theatrical success. Reading plays became a leisure activity for the educated. Cultural exchange across Europe intensified. Works could be translated and published in multiple languages. Italian literature influenced French writers, who influenced English authors. Classical texts translated into various vernaculars influenced national literatures. This cross-fertilization created European literary culture with shared themes and forms despite linguistic diversity. Education was revolutionized. Textbooks made standardized curriculum possible. Students could own books rather than depending entirely on lectures and memorization. Self-education became feasible. Ambitious individuals could acquire books and learn independently. Literacy became more valuable as printed material became more common, creating a positive feedback loop driving educational expansion. Grammar books and dictionaries standardized languages. In manuscript culture, spelling and usage varied widely. Printed grammar books established norms. Dictionaries defined words, fixed meanings, and standardized spelling. The invention of national standard languages, Standard English, Standard French, Hochdeutsch, was enabled by printed books that established norms everyone could consult. Encyclopedias organized knowledge systematically. Works like Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, 1751 to 1772, attempted to compile all human knowledge in alphabetical, accessible form. These massive projects were only conceivable in print culture. They both reflected and contributed to the systematization of knowledge characteristic of the Enlightenment. Practical knowledge spread through how-to books. Manuals on bookkeeping, navigation, surveying, farming, cooking, household management, and countless other topics made specialized knowledge accessible. A merchant could teach himself double-entry bookkeeping from a printed manual. A gentleman could learn estate management from agricultural treatises. This democratization of practical knowledge contributed to economic development. Cookbooks transformed culinary culture. Recipes that had been passed orally or kept as manuscript secrets could be printed and shared. Regional cuisines were codified. Cooking techniques spread across social classes and regions. The idea of cuisine as something that could be learned from books rather than only through apprenticeship was novel. Travel literature expanded horizons. Printed accounts of voyages to the Americas, Asia, and Africa brought knowledge of distant lands to European readers. These accounts shaped European understanding of the wider world, for better and worse. The fascination with exotic places, peoples, and cultures was fed by printed travel narratives. Maps became widely available. Printed atlases allowed people to visualize geography beyond their personal experience. The standardization of cartographic conventions through printing improved maps' accuracy and usefulness. Maps became tools for merchants, administrators, and anyone interested in understanding the spatial world. Children's literature emerged as a distinct genre. Books written specifically for children, educational, moral, and entertaining, appeared in increasing numbers. The idea that childhood was a distinct phase deserving specialized literature developed partly because printing made economically viable production of books for this market. Women's access to print was complicated. As authors, women faced significant barriers. Writing was considered unfeminine, publication was difficult, and women writers were often criticized or dismissed. Yet some women published successfully, and the number increased over time. As readers, women formed an important market, especially for novels and devotional literature. Female literacy increased partly because of the availability of printed material. The economics of book production changed dramatically. In manuscript culture, books were bespoke products made to order. With printing, publishers produced editions speculatively, hoping to sell them. This required capital, created business risks, and led to the development of the book trade as a specialized industry with publishers, printers, booksellers, and distributors. Book fairs, like those at Frankfurt and Leipzig, became major commercial events where publishers displayed their catalogs, sold rights, and conducted business. These fairs created international book trade networks. A book printed in Venice might be sold in Paris, London, and Krakow through these commercial networks. The concept of bestsellers emerged. Some books sold in huge quantities, religious works, certain classical texts, controversial pamphlets. Publishers learned to identify and profit from popular demand. The economics of printing rewarded publishers who could anticipate or create popular interest. Yet access remained unequal. The poor still couldn't afford books. Rural populations had less access than urban ones. Women had less access than men. The illiterate majority remained largely excluded. The democratization of knowledge, while real, was partial and incomplete. Still, the direction was clear. Knowledge was spreading to ever larger segments of society, and this trend would continue for centuries. For every liberating aspect of printing, there was a darker counterpart. The same technology that spread knowledge also spread lies, that enabled free expression also enabled manipulation, that challenged authority also created new forms of control. Understanding printing's full impact requires acknowledging these troubling dimensions. Authorities quickly recognized printing's dangers. If dangerous ideas could spread rapidly, they had to be controlled. Censorship systems were established across Europe, varying in severity but sharing common purpose: preventing the publication and distribution of heretical, seditious, or morally objectionable material. The Catholic Church developed the most systematic censorship regime. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Forbidden Books, first issued in 1559 and updated regularly until 1966, listed books Catholics were forbidden to read. The list included Protestant texts, works of science that contradicted church teaching, and literature deemed immoral. Possessing, selling, or reading index books could result in punishment, including excommunication. The imprimatur system required that books on religious subjects be approved by church censors before publication. Printers were required to obtain permission, and texts might be modified or rejected. This pre-publication censorship aimed to prevent dangerous ideas from ever reaching the public. Enforcement varied by region. In Spain and Italy, control was relatively tight. In Northern Europe, it was less effective. Secular authorities established their own censorship systems. Royal licenses, required for publishing in many jurisdictions, gave governments control over the press. Printers who published without permission or who printed seditious or libelous material could lose their licenses, face fines, or be imprisoned. In extreme cases, printers were executed for publishing forbidden material. Yet censorship faced inherent limitations. Books banned in one jurisdiction could be printed in another. Protestant cities printed Catholic-banned books. Catholic cities printed anti-Protestant material. Books flowed across borders despite prohibitions. The decentralized nature of printing, with presses in hundreds of cities across dozens of political jurisdictions, made comprehensive control impossible. Clandestine printing flourished. Printers published controversial works without identifying themselves, using false imprints claiming the book was printed in distant cities where censors wouldn't look. Underground networks distributed forbidden books. Manuscripts of banned works circulated when printing was too dangerous. Authorities could slow the spread of ideas but rarely stop it entirely. The result was a cat-and-mouse game between censors and printers, authors and authorities. Some printers specialized in controversial material, accepting the risks for the profits. Others were cautious, self-censoring to avoid trouble. Authors learned to write carefully, using allegory or indirect language to convey dangerous ideas without explicit statement that could be prosecuted. But censorship wasn't the only problem. Printing's capacity for mass communication made it a powerful tool for propaganda and manipulation. Governments, churches, and political factions used printing to shape opinion, demonize opponents, and justify their actions. Religious propaganda during the Reformation era was particularly vicious. Both sides produced illustrated pamphlets depicting opponents as demons, monsters, or fools. The Pope was shown as the Antichrist, Luther as a tool of Satan. These crude but effective images reached those who couldn't read text but could understand pictures. The emotional impact shaped attitudes and hardened sectarian divisions. Political propaganda served ruling authorities. Printed proclamations announced laws and justified policies. Pamphlets defending government actions were produced and distributed. During wars, propaganda portrayed enemies as barbarous and one's own side as virtuous. The printing press became a weapon, deployed to maintain control and mobilize support. Witchcraft pamphlets exemplify printing's role in moral panics. The 16th and 17th centuries saw intensive witch hunting across Europe, resulting in thousands of executions. Printed manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, described how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches. Pamphlets sensationalized witch trials, creating public hysteria. The spread of these materials contributed to the persecution of predominantly poor women accused of witchcraft. Sensationalism and fake news were not invented by modern media. Early modern print produced accounts of monstrous births, prodigies, comets, and other sensational phenomena that mixed fact, exaggeration, and fiction. These publications sold well because they entertained and shocked. Readers couldn't always distinguish reliable accounts from fabrications. Crime pamphlets describing murders, executions, and criminal exploits were popular. These often included moral lessons but were primarily entertainment, feeding public fascination with transgression and punishment. The mixture of moral instruction and sensational detail anticipated modern crime media. Astrological predictions and almanacs were bestsellers. These publications claimed to forecast weather, political events, and personal fortunes based on celestial movements. While some contained useful information like calendar dates and agricultural advice, the predictive claims were largely nonsense. Yet millions of copies sold annually, showing that printing spread popular superstition as readily as scientific knowledge. Fraud and forgery were problems. Texts attributed to famous authors might be spurious. Classical texts might be fabrications. Medical advice might be dangerous. Readers had limited means to verify authenticity or accuracy. The printing press's authority, the suggestion that printed text was more reliable than manuscript, could make false information more credible. The literacy divide created new forms of exclusion. As print culture became more important, illiteracy became a greater disadvantage. Those who couldn't read were excluded from debates, information, and opportunities available to the literate. The gap between educated and uneducated widened, even as literacy gradually spread. Gender barriers persisted and in some ways strengthened. While female literacy increased, women faced obstacles accessing higher education and entering learned professions. Women's exclusion from many institutions meant they had less access to libraries, less opportunity to publish, and less authority in print culture. Print culture was predominantly male culture. Class barriers remained formidable. Books, though cheaper than manuscripts, were still expensive by working-class standards. A day laborer's wages might not buy a single book. The time required for reading was a luxury workers couldn't afford. Print culture was accessible primarily to middle and upper classes, with working people largely excluded. Rural populations had less access than urban ones. Booksellers operated in cities. Libraries were urban institutions. The intellectual excitement of print culture was primarily an urban phenomenon. Rural areas remained more traditional, less connected to the transformative currents flowing through printed material. The concentration of printing in certain cities and countries created information hierarchies. Venice, Paris, London, Amsterdam. These centers dominated book production and trade. Peripheral regions depended on imports, had fewer printers, and participated less fully in print culture. This geographic inequality in information access persisted for centuries. Yet despite these dark aspects, censorship, propaganda, sensationalism, inequality, printing's overall trajectory was toward greater access, more open debate, and increased questioning of authority. The tools of control were never as effective as authorities hoped. The capacity for manipulation existed, but so did the capacity for critical thinking and resistance. Print's liberating potential, though never fully realized and always contested, ultimately proved stronger than attempts to control it. 5.5 centuries after Gutenberg printed his Bible, we can see how profoundly printing shaped the modern world. The long-term consequences of this innovation extended far beyond anything its inventor could have imagined, touching every aspect of human civilization. The Enlightenment of the 18th century was built on print culture. The philosophes Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Hume, and others used printing to spread ideas about reason, progress, individual rights, and social reform. Their works circulated across Europe in multiple editions and translations, creating an international intellectual movement. The encyclopedia, with its systematic organization of knowledge and implicit challenge to traditional authority, exemplified Enlightenment values and was only possible through printing. Democratic revolutions drew heavily on printed political philosophy. The American Revolution was preceded by years of pamphlet debates about rights, representation, and legitimate government. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, 1776, advocating independence, sold 500,000 copies in a population of 2.5 million, a bestseller of unprecedented reach. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution were printed and distributed, creating shared political texts that defined the new nation. The French Revolution similarly relied on printed material. Pamphlets, newspapers, and broadsides debated every aspect of government, rights, and social organization. Revolutionary ideas spread through print, mobilizing support and shaping events. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was printed and posted publicly. Revolutionary newspapers kept the public informed and inflamed. The concept of human rights itself, now taken for granted, emerged partly from print culture. Ideas about natural rights, individual liberty, and equality could be articulated in books and pamphlets, debated publicly and gradually accepted. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, stands in a tradition of rights declarations made possible by printing. Nationalism developed alongside print. Benedict Anderson argued that nations are imagined communities created partly through print capitalism. When people across a large territory read the same language in newspapers and books, they began imagining themselves as members of a national community. Standardized languages, national literatures, and shared historical narratives all depended on printing. The Industrial Revolution was enabled by printed technical knowledge. Manuals on machinery, manufacturing processes, and new technologies spread innovations rapidly. Engineers could learn from printed texts rather than only through apprenticeship. The systematic improvement of technology characteristic of industrialization required the communication networks printing provided. Universal education became possible and eventually necessary. As industrial economies required literate workers and democratic societies required informed citizens, education expanded. Printed textbooks made standardized mass education feasible. Literacy rates climbed from perhaps 20 to 30% in 18th century Europe to nearly 100% by the 20th century in developed nations. The novel became the dominant literary form, shaping how people understood themselves and society. From Richardson and Fielding through Austen, Dickens, Tolstoy, and countless others, novels created shared imaginative worlds. The bourgeois reading public consumed novels voraciously, with successful authors achieving fame and wealth impossible before printing. News media evolved into powerful institutions. The free press became a pillar of democratic societies, providing information and holding power accountable. Newspapers, though sometimes sensational or biased, created informed publics. The concept of the Fourth Estate, the press as a check on government, arose from printing's capacity to distribute information widely. Scientific and technological progress accelerated continuously. The cumulative nature of scientific knowledge, enabled by printing, allowed each generation to build on previous work. The pace of innovation increased exponentially. The modern world of technology and science is unimaginable without the communication networks printing created. Copyright law developed to balance authors' and publishers' interests with public access. The concept of intellectual property, now central to creative and knowledge industries, emerged from printing. While imperfect and often controversial, copyright recognized that ideas have value and that creators deserve recognition and compensation. Libraries evolved from rare book repositories to public institutions. The public library movement of the 19th century democratized access to books, reflecting the belief that knowledge should be available to all. Libraries became community centers, educational resources, and symbols of civic values. This development built on centuries of print accumulation. Yet printing's dominance, which lasted for 5 centuries, is now ending. Digital technology is producing a transformation comparable to the shift from manuscript to print. Ebooks, online publishing, digital libraries, and the internet are creating new forms of knowledge production and distribution. We're living through a revolution analogous to what Europeans experienced in the 15th and 16th centuries. The parallels are striking. Digital technology enables rapid reproduction and distribution of information. It challenges traditional gatekeepers and established authorities. It creates information abundance that can be overwhelming. It raises questions about reliability, authority, and truth. It enables both democratic participation and propaganda. The anxiety some feel about digital media echoes concerns raised about printing 5 centuries ago. What can we learn from printing's history? First, that technology is not neutral. It amplifies human capacities for good and ill. Printing spread truth and lies, liberation and propaganda, knowledge and superstition. Digital technology does the same. Second, that information revolutions are disruptive. Printing challenged religious and political authority, transformed social structures, and created winners and losers. Current transformations are similarly disruptive, with traditional media struggling, new platforms rising, and society adapting to new information landscapes. Third, that control is difficult. Despite censorship efforts, printing enabled the spread of ideas authorities wanted to suppress. Today, despite attempts to control digital information, the internet routes around censorship. Information wants to be free, as the saying goes. Fourth, that adaptation takes time. The full implications of printing took centuries to unfold. We're only beginning to understand digital technology's consequences. The transformation is ongoing, and its ultimate impact remains unknown. We began in a workshop in Mainz in 1450, where a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was perfecting a technology that would change the world. We end in our own time, experiencing our own information revolution, looking back across 5.5 centuries at what Gutenberg's invention wrought. The printing press was not one invention but a synthesis of technologies. Movable type, the type mold, oil-based ink, the press itself, combined into a revolutionary system. Gutenberg's achievement was technical but also imaginative. He saw the possibility of something new, something that would transform how information was produced and shared. He probably couldn't have imagined Martin Luther, whose use of printing would shatter Western Christianity's unity. He couldn't have foreseen Galileo and Newton, whose printed works would revolutionize human understanding of nature. He couldn't have anticipated democratic revolutions justified by printed political philosophy. He couldn't have imagined the world we inhabit, where books are commonplace, where universal literacy is expected, where printed words surround us constantly. Yet all of this flows, at least in part, from that moment when he pulled the first sheet of the Gutenberg Bible from his press. The connection between that moment and our modern world runs through printing, through the slow but inexorable transformation of how knowledge is created, validated, shared, and used. Gutenberg died without wealth or fame, his equipment seized by creditors, his achievement barely recognized. Yet he changed humanity's trajectory more profoundly than most kings, generals, or popes. His press didn't just copy books, it transformed human consciousness, making possible new ways of thinking together, new forms of community, new challenges to authority, new accumulations of knowledge. The printed word became the foundation of modern civilization. Democracy requires informed citizens, possible only with widespread literacy and accessible information. Science requires cumulative knowledge, possible only with reliable communication. Education requires standardized texts, possible only with mass production. Economic development requires technical knowledge, possible only with widely distributed information. The printing press didn't cause all these developments directly, but it was necessary for all of them. It was the enabling technology, the infrastructure on which modernity was built. No printing, no Reformation. No printing, no scientific revolution. No printing, no enlightenment, no democratic revolutions, no modern world as we know it. We're now experiencing the digital revolution, and the parallels to the printing revolution are instructive. Both technologies democratize information, challenge established authorities, enable new forms of community, and create anxiety about reliability and control. Both are disruptive, transformative, and ultimately liberating despite their problems. Gutenberg would recognize our moment, the excitement, the anxiety, the sense that everything is changing. He lived through similar transformations. His world of rare manuscripts gave way to a world of abundant print. Our world of print is giving way to a world of digital information. The transition is disorienting but also exhilarating. The fundamental insight remains. Information technology shapes civilization. How we store and share knowledge determines what kind of society we can build. Manuscript culture produced medieval Christendom. Print culture produced modernity. Digital culture is producing something new, something whose full contours we can't yet discern but which will be as different from print culture as print culture was from manuscript culture. Perhaps 5 centuries from now, historians will look back on our moment, the transition from print to digital, as we look back on Gutenberg's moment. They'll see connections and consequences we can't yet imagine. They'll understand our transformation as part of the long human story of learning to think together, to accumulate knowledge, to build civilization. Gutenberg's gift to humanity was the means to think collectively at scale, to preserve and share knowledge across time and space, to challenge authority with information, to learn from each other across vast distances. His invention didn't just change how we print books. It changed what it means to be human in a world where knowledge can be shared. In that workshop in Mainz 5.5 centuries ago, the future was being printed 1 page at a time. The revolution Gutenberg started is still unfolding. The printing press gave us modernity. What digital technology will give us remains to be seen. But we can be certain that, like Gutenberg's invention, it will reshape human civilization in ways we can barely begin to imagine. The story of the printing press is ultimately a story about human potential, about our capacity to innovate, to adapt, to use new tools to expand what's possible. It's a story about the power of ideas, once they're freed to spread. It's a story about how technology and culture shape each other, creating feedback loops that transform societies. And it's a reminder that individual human beings, working with vision and determination despite obstacles, can change the world. Gutenberg was one person, struggling with debt and technical challenges, laboring in obscurity. Yet his work echoes across centuries, still shaping our lives today. That's the ultimate legacy of the printing press. The demonstration that information technology matters, that how we communicate shapes what we can become, and that revolutions in how we share knowledge are revolutions in human possibility itself. From Gutenberg's workshop to our digital age, the story continues, the endless human quest to know more, to share what we know, and to build together the civilization we imagine.